The morning air on Jeju Island carried a strange energy that Dr. Lee Min-jun had never felt before. As he walked along the rocky coastline where their research station stood, something felt different. The waves crashed against the shore with an unusual rhythm, almost like they were trying to tell him something. Min-jun had been studying marine life for over 15 years, but today the ocean seemed alive in a way he couldn't explain. He knelt beside a tide pool and noticed something impossible. Sea creatures that should have died out decades ago were swimming around like nothing had happened. The purple sea slugs his grandmother used to tell him stories about were right there, moving through the water. These weren't supposed to exist anymore. Climate change and pollution had killed them off when he was still a child. Meanwhile, high in the mountains of Gangwon Province, Dr. Park Soo-jin was having her own mysterious encounter. She had come to study the effects of acid rain on native plants, but what she found made her question everything she knew about botany. Ancient trees that had been cut down years ago were somehow growing back in the exact same spots. Their bark showed no signs of being young regrowths. They looked exactly as they had before being chopped down. What puzzled her most was how the plants seemed to be communicating. When she touched one tree, the leaves of nearby trees would rustle without any wind. It was as if they were warning each other about her presence. Soo-jin had read about plant communication through root networks. But this was different. This was faster, more intentional, almost like they were thinking. Several hours away near the border between North and South Korea, Dr. Kim Ji-hoon was tracking bird migration patterns. The DMZ had become an unexpected wildlife sanctuary over the decades, but what he saw that morning challenged everything he knew about animal behavior. Thousands of birds that had been declared extinct were flying in perfect formations. They moved like a single organism, turning and diving in synchronization that seemed impossible without some kind of advanced communication system. The most shocking part wasn't just that these birds existed, it was how organized they were. They flew in mathematical patterns, creating shapes in the sky that looked almost like writing. Ji-hoon grabbed his binoculars and watched as they formed spirals, triangles, and complex geometric designs. It reminded him of how ancient Koreans used to send messages through smoke signals, but far more sophisticated. Down in Busan, Dr. Choi Yerim was having her afternoon tea when her garden exploded with color. Butterflies that hadn't been seen in Korea for decades suddenly filled her yard. These weren't just any butterflies. They were species she had only seen in old textbooks and faded photographs her grandfather had shown her as a child. But these butterflies were different from their ancestors. Their wings seemed to shimmer with an unusual iridescence, and they moved with purpose rather than the random fluttering usually associated with butterflies. They gathered around her research equipment, almost like they were trying to understand what she was doing. When she tried to photograph them, they positioned themselves perfectly as if posing for her camera. As the day progressed, all 4 researchers began reaching out to colleagues around the world. What they discovered sent chills down their spines. Similar reports were coming in from every continent. Scientists in Brazil reported seeing jaguars that had been extinct in certain regions for years. Researchers in Madagascar documented lemur, species thought to be gone forever. Marine biologists in Australia spotted coral formations that had bleached and died decades ago, now somehow thriving again. The pattern was becoming clear. These weren't just random sightings of rare animals. These were species that had been pushed to extinction by human activities. Climate change, deforestation, pollution, habitat destruction. And now they were back. But different. Smarter. More coordinated. Almost like they had spent their time in extinction learning, planning, preparing for something. Min-jun stood on the shore as the sun set over Jeju Island, watching those impossible sea creatures dance in the waves. He felt a mixture of wonder and unease. His scientific mind wanted to understand what was happening, but something deeper, something primal, whispered that this was bigger than any research project. This felt like a warning, like nature itself was trying to tell humanity something important. Each of the 4 researchers went to bed that night with the same questions running through their minds. Where had these creatures been? How had they survived? And most importantly, why were they coming back now? None of them could have imagined that they were witnessing the first signs of the most extraordinary event in human history. A moment when extinction itself would be redefined, and humanity would face judgment from the very life they thought they had destroyed. The awakening had begun, and tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything. 2 weeks after the first sightings, Dr. Lee Min-jun found himself staring at his computer screen in disbelief. What had started as isolated incidents was now a global phenomenon. His email inbox was flooded with messages from researchers worldwide, all reporting the same impossible thing: extinct species returning with behaviors that defied everything they knew about animal intelligence. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Park Soo-jin. They had been colleagues for years, but never had he heard the excitement mixed with fear in her voice like he did that morning. "Min-jun, you need to see what's happening here," Soo-jin said, her voice trembling slightly. "These plants aren't just growing back. They're organizing. I've been mapping their root systems, and they're creating patterns that look almost like circuit boards. Yesterday, I watched them coordinate the movement of nutrients between different species. It's like they're building a network." Meanwhile, Dr. Kim Ji-hoon was having similar conversations with bird researchers across Asia. The extinct birds weren't just flying randomly. They were carrying objects: small twigs, pieces of metal, even fragments of plastic. When he followed their flight paths using GPS trackers, he discovered they were depositing these items in specific locations, building structures that served unknown purposes. "It's like they're following a blueprint," he explained to his research team. But here's the strangest part. Birds from different continents are building identical structures. How is that possible without some form of long-distance communication we've never seen before? In Busan, Dr. Choi Ye-rim made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The butterflies weren't just beautiful, they were technological. When she examined them under a microscope, she found something impossible. Their wing patterns contained what looked like microscopic data storage systems. Each butterfly carried different information, but when they flew together, they seemed to share and process this data collectively. "It's like they're living computers," she whispered to her assistant, "but not artificial, something far more advanced than anything we've created." The 4 researchers decided to meet in Seoul to share their findings. In a small conference room at Seoul National University, they spread out their data, photographs, and video recordings. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. The sea creatures Min-jun had found weren't just swimming randomly. Using underwater cameras, he had discovered they were building structures on the ocean floor. Cities, almost. These weren't crude nests or burrows, but complex architectural designs with passages, chambers, and what appeared to be communication hubs. Soo-jin's plants had created a network that spanned hundreds of kilometers. When she poured colored water at one location, the dye appeared at connected plants 50 kilometers away within hours. They had somehow developed a transportation system faster than anything humans had built. Ji-hoon's birds were establishing waypoints, strategic locations where different species met to exchange information. At these sites, he had observed birds that had never interacted in nature working together on complex tasks. Extinct Korean eagles worked alongside species from Africa and South America, suggesting a level of international coordination that seemed impossible. Ye-rim's butterflies were perhaps the most mysterious. They appeared to be memory banks, storing information from the past and sharing it with others. Through careful observation, she realized they were teaching younger generations not just survival skills, but complex problem-solving techniques. As the weeks passed, more researchers joined their informal network. Dr. Singh from India reported wolves working with leopards to rebuild forest ecosystems. Dr. Martinez from Mexico documented extinct bee species that were somehow cleaning polluted rivers. Dr. Johnson from Australia found that extinct fish were actually filtering toxins from the ocean. The pattern became clear. These returned species weren't just surviving, they were actively working to repair the damage humans had caused to the environment. But they were doing it with a level of intelligence and coordination that surpassed anything seen in nature before. Min-jun spent sleepless nights analyzing the data. "There's something connecting all of this," he told the others during one of their video calls. These species aren't acting independently. There's some kind of central intelligence guiding them. The beast. Proof came when Yerim noticed that butterfly flights began synchronizing across continents. At exactly the same time each day, butterflies worldwide would pause their activities and orient themselves in specific directions, like compasses pointing toward some invisible magnetic field. Su Jin discovered that plants worldwide would simultaneously release pollen clouds even when it wasn't their natural reproductive season. The pollen seemed to carry more than genetic material. Chemical analysis showed it contained complex molecular structures that looked like coded messages. The most chilling discovery came from Ji-hoon. The bird formations weren't random at all. When he mapped all the structures they had built worldwide, they formed a mathematical pattern, a geometric design that covered the entire Earth. It was as if they were preparing the planet for something. As the researchers compiled their findings, one truth became undeniable. These returned species shared a collective consciousness that transcended individual animals, plants, or even entire species. They were parts of something larger, something that had been waiting, watching, and preparing for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The convergence was complete. Now humanity would have to face the consequences of their actions, guided by an intelligence that had learned from extinction itself. The morning of March 15th started like any other day, but by noon, the world had changed forever. Dr. Min-jun was reviewing data at his lab when his phone started buzzing with emergency alerts. He looked at the screen and felt his blood run cold. Reports were flooding in from every corner of the globe. Major, industrial sites were under attack. But these weren't terrorist attacks carried out by humans. The attackers were the very animals and plants they had been studying. At the Pohang Steel Company, South Korea's largest steel plant, workers watched in horror as thousands of evolved sea creatures emerged from the nearby ocean. These weren't the small, delicate animals Min-jun had first observed. They had somehow grown larger, stronger, and moved with military precision. The creatures worked together to disable the plant's cooling systems, causing a complete shutdown, without a single human casualty. Su Jin received a panicked call from her research partner in the Amazon. "The trees are moving," the voice on the other end whispered. "I don't mean swaying in the wind, they're actually walking. Root systems are pulling out of the ground and the trees are relocating mining equipment piece by piece. They're dismantling the entire operation." Similar reports came in from around the world. In Australia, extinct kangaroo species surrounded uranium mines, somehow generating electromagnetic fields that made all electronic equipment malfunction. In Norway, fish thought to be extinct formed massive schools that blocked offshore oil, drilling platforms preventing any work from continuing. The most shocking event happened simultaneously across 12 countries. At exactly 3:14 p.m. local time in each location, power grids began failing. But this wasn't random equipment failure. Security cameras showed impossible scenes, extinct insects working in perfect coordination to manipulate electrical systems. They moved like tiny soldiers, each knowing exactly what to do without any visible communication. Ji-hoon was in his lab when the lights went out. Through his window, he could see the sky filled with birds, not just extinct species, but every bird in the area. They flew in complex patterns, creating dark clouds that seemed to bend light itself. Military radar stations reported that these bird formations were somehow jamming their equipment. The governments tried to respond with force, but their weapons wouldn't work. Jets that approached the bird formations found their engines mysteriously failing. Warships sent to deal with the marine creatures discovered their radar and sonar systems completely scrambled. It was as if the animals had developed technology far beyond human understanding. Yerim watched from her apartment as butterflies swarmed around military vehicles in Busan. The beautiful insects landed on tanks and helicopters, their wings somehow creating an interference that disabled all electronic systems. Soldiers tried to brush them away, but whenever they did, more butterflies would appear, as if summoned from thin air. Within 48 hours, every major industrial operation on Earth had been peacefully but effectively shut down. Coal plants, oil refineries, factories pumping out toxic waste, all silent. The animals had targeted only the installations that were most harmful to the environment. leaving hospitals, schools, and residential areas completely untouched. The message was clear, but humanity's leaders struggled to accept it. How could animals, even evolved ones, coordinate such a precise global operation? The answer came when all the world's screens, television, computers, phones, displayed the same message simultaneously. But it wasn't written in any human language. Instead, it was shown through living pictures, patterns created by butterfly wings, formations of birds, and movements of sea creatures. Human linguists and computer programmers worked frantically to decode the message. Dr. Min Jun and his team joined the effort, using their understanding of animal behavior to interpret what they were seeing. The message, when finally translated, was simple but chilling: stop, or we will stop you. The world's stock markets crashed as industries ground to a halt. But strangely, the environment began to heal almost immediately. Air pollution levels dropped dramatically. Rivers that had been toxic for decades started running clearer. The ozone hole began to shrink at a rate that scientists said was impossible. Humanity faced a choice they had never imagined possible. These evolved creatures weren't trying to destroy human civilization. They were trying to save the planet from it. Every action they took removed another source of environmental damage, but left human society intact. Some world leaders called for all-out war against the animals, but their weapons remained mysteriously inoperable. Others advocated for negotiation. But how do you negotiate with an intelligence that communicates through the movement of entire ecosystems? As the days passed, it became clear that the animals were in complete control. They had spent their time in extinction learning, growing, and developing abilities that made them unstoppable. They had returned not just to survive, but to take back their planet. Min Jun stood on the shore of Jeju Island, watching the sea creatures dance in the waves. The water was cleaner than it had been in decades. The air smelled fresher, but the price of this environmental recovery was humanity's loss of dominance. The reckoning had come. Nature had evolved beyond human control, and now it was humanity's turn to adapt, or face the same extinction they had inflicted on countless other species. The silence that had fallen over the world was deeper than anything humanity had ever experienced. For 3 days, the evolved animals had maintained their control over industrial facilities, but they hadn't attacked any cities or towns. They simply waited, as if giving humanity time to understand something important. Dr. Min Jun couldn't sleep. He spent his nights walking along the beach, watching the strange lights that sometimes flickered beneath the ocean's surface. On the 4th night, something extraordinary happened. As he stood at the water's edge, hundreds of sea creatures surfaced simultaneously, creating intricate patterns in the water. The patterns seemed to pulse with a soft, bioluminescent glow. That's when he noticed it. The patterns matched the mathematical sequences he had seen in ancient Korean texts about natural cycles. His grandmother had told him stories about how his ancestors believed everything in nature was connected by invisible threads. Looking at these patterns, Min Jun felt like he was seeing those threads for the first time. Soo-jin made a similar discovery in the mountains. The plants weren't just communicating with each other. They were creating a massive living laboratory. She watched as different species worked together to neutralize toxic soil. Mushrooms broke down harmful chemicals while trees filtered the air and small plants organized minerals in the ground. It was like watching cells in a body work together to heal an injury. But the most incredible part was how they seemed to remember. New growth appeared exactly where extinct plants had lived centuries ago, as if the very earth held memories of what had once been. Soo-jin collected samples and found something impossible. Genetic information from species that had died out hundreds of years ago was somehow present in the soil. Ji-hoon's breakthrough came when he started listening instead of just watching. Using sensitive audio equipment, he recorded the sounds the birds made during their formations. When he slowed down these recordings and analyzed them, he discovered they contained complex mathematical patterns that matched the frequency of the Earth's natural resonance. It was as if the birds were tuning themselves to the planet's heartbeat. More incredibly, when he compared recordings from different continents, he found that birds thousands of miles apart were singing in perfect harmony, creating a global symphony that humanity had never heard before. Yerim's discovery was perhaps the most mind-blowing. While studying the butterfly's microscopic wing patterns, she realized they contained what looked like historical records. Each butterfly carried pieces of information about past environmental conditions, about species that had lived and died, about the slow changes that had led to mass extinctions. When she managed to decode some of this information, she found records going back millions of years. The butterflies were living libraries, carrying the memory of life itself. They knew every species that had ever lived, every ecosystem that had ever existed, and every environmental disaster that had ever occurred. The four researchers shared their findings in a secure video call, and the picture that emerged was staggering. These weren't just evolved animals and plants. They were connected to something much older and much larger than individual species. It's like they're part of one massive organism, Minjun said, his voice filled with awe. An organism that's as old as life itself. Sujin nodded. The plants showed me something today. When I put my hand on an ancient tree, I could feel memories. Not my memories, but memories of every creature that had ever lived in that forest. Jihoon played recordings that made them all fall silent. Listen to this, he said. This isn't just birdsong. It's information. They're sharing the history of the planet through sound. Yerim pulled up her latest research. And look at this. The genetic information stored in the butterflies isn't random. It's organized like the most advanced database ever created. They know everything. Every extinction event. Every environmental change. Every time humans have damaged the ecosystem. As they talked, a pattern emerged. These returned species weren't separate at all. They were expressions of something that had existed since the beginning of life on Earth. A planetary intelligence that had been quietly guiding evolution, protecting genetic information, and preparing for moments like this. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. During mass extinction events, this intelligence hadn't let species truly die. Instead, it had somehow stored them, preserved them in a state beyond normal existence, waiting for the right moment to bring them back. That's why they're so advanced, Minjun whispered. They've had millions of years to develop. Every extinction made them stronger. The message that had appeared on the world screen suddenly made sense. It wasn't a threat from invading aliens or evolved animals. It was a warning from the planet itself. Earth was alive in a way humanity had never imagined, and it was tired of being hurt. The four friends sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. Humanity hadn't been fighting against invading species. They had been fighting against the very consciousness of life itself, a consciousness that remembered every species they had driven to extinction, every forest they had cut down, every ocean they had polluted. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't a war between humans and animals. This was Earth's immune system finally responding to what it saw as a deadly infection. Human civilization, as it currently existed. They were about to witness something unprecedented. The planet's attempt to heal itself with or without humanity's cooperation. The morning of the 7th day after the shutdown was different. Minjun woke up feeling like someone was calling his name, though no one was there. Around the world, scientists, doctors, teachers, and people who had dedicated their lives to protecting the environment felt the same pull. The message that appeared on every screen was simple. Those who understand may come. Minjun didn't hesitate. He packed his research notes and headed to Jeju's highest peak, where the sea creatures had been gathering. Sujin left her mountain laboratory and walked toward the ancient forest where her plants seemed most active. Jihoon found himself drawn to a field where thousands of birds waited in perfect formation. Yerim followed the butterflies to a valley, filled with flowers that hadn't bloomed in Korea for centuries. They weren't alone. Across the globe, people felt compelled to go to specific places where the evolved creatures were strongest. Most world leaders, military commanders, and industrial executives felt nothing. They continued planning ways to regain control, to force the world back to how it was. When Minjun reached the mountain peak, something extraordinary happened. The sea creatures rose from the waters. But instead of the frightening display of power from before, they approached gently. One of them, a creature that looked like a cross between an octopus and something from another world, extended what might have been a tentacle toward him. Touch it, his mind somehow heard. Understand. The moment Min-jun made contact, the world exploded into images, memories, and feelings that weren't his own. He saw the Earth as it truly was. Not just a planet with separate creatures living on it, but a single, living organism where every part was connected. He experienced what it felt like to watch 90% of your species disappear in a few decades. He felt the pain of forests being cut down, of oceans turning acidic, of the sky filling with poison. But most shocking was the realization that every extinction had been stored, every destroyed ecosystem preserved in a dimension beyond normal, space and time. The planet itself was alive and had been patiently waiting for humanity to mature enough to understand this truth. When they didn't, when they instead accelerated the destruction, Earth's immune system had finally activated. Su Jin, touching an ancient tree, experienced the same flood of understanding. She felt the forest's memories, how it had sheltered countless species, how it had cleaned the air, how it had given life freely to all creatures. She understood that her research had always been guided, that the plants had been trying to teach her, not the other way around. Ji-hoon, surrounded by birds, felt himself become part of their global communication network. He experienced the joy of migration, the sorrow of finding no safe places to land, the frustration of watching the sky fill with chemicals. He understood that the birds carried messages not just between each other but between all life forms, connecting the planet in ways humans had never imagined. Yi Rim, as butterflies landed on her arms and shoulders, became a living database herself. She accessed memories from billions of years of evolution, understanding how every creature had contributed to the grand story of life. She saw how extinction was never really the end, but a transformation, a storing of information, until it could be safely released again. Around the world, others who had been chosen experienced the same revelation. The planetary consciousness didn't want to destroy humanity. It wanted them to evolve. But evolution required understanding, and understanding required experiencing the truth. Those who touched the evolved creatures and saw the truth found themselves changed. They became bridges between the old humanity and the new Earth. They could communicate with both the returning species and their fellow humans, helping to translate between two forms of life that had grown dangerously apart. The judgment wasn't destruction. It was choice. Humans could continue as they had been, isolated in shrinking areas where technology still worked, protected, but powerless. Or they could join the planetary community, learning to live as partners rather than dominators of nature. Major cities found their industrial zones permanently shut down, but their residential areas untouched. Schools and hospitals continued to function, but factories and mines remained dormant. Humanity could survive, even thrive, but only in ways that didn't harm the planet. Min-jun stood at the research facility that had been transformed into something he could barely comprehend. Humans and evolved creatures worked side by side, using technologies that blended biology and innovation in ways he had never imagined possible. The ocean was cleaner than it had been in centuries, the air was pure, and species that had been extinct were returning home. Some humans adapted quickly, embracing their new role as participants rather than owners of Earth. Others struggled, clinging to old ways of thinking, complaining about the loss of their technological power. But the planet was patient. It had waited millions of years for this moment and could wait longer still. As Min-jun watched the sunrise over a healed ocean, he realized the judgment had been perfect. Humanity had been given exactly what they needed, the chance to experience what they had inflicted on countless other species. Some chose to learn from this experience and become part of Earth's community. Others chose to remain separate, protected, but irrelevant. The planet had spoken, not through destruction, but through wisdom. Those who listened would be part of a new world. Those who didn't would simply be left behind, fossils of a civilization that had failed to evolve when evolution had been offered to them freely. The age of domination was over. The age of cooperation had begun.